My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Mr. Dan Gardner. Dan, introduce yourself to the audience. I mean, you've been an incredible, prolific author for some time, but what's your background? How'd you get involved in the business of being an author to begin with, and what are some of your main interests?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Michael. Well, I've had a pretty long and varied career, or checkered, depending upon how you want to describe it. I trained as a lawyer in another life. I have a background in history, believe it or not. I worked as a political staffer. I became a journalist. I did that for many, many years. Then, as an outgrowth of the journalism, I started writing books. I started with risk perception, basically why people are afraid of things that they shouldn't be afraid of and aren't afraid of things that they probably should be. And that introduced me to psychology, and that's basically been my modern career for the past, what is it now, 18 years. I've been writing about how people think, how people perceive reality, how people think, how they make decisions. And so, as I say, I took that in the first book. I took that in the direction of risk psychology. I wrote a couple of books about forecasting, including super forecasting with Philip Tetlock that you mentioned. And my latest book is about how big things get done, which is about the planning and delivery of big projects, which is everything from giant infrastructure right down to home renovations, which you might think is a bit of a variation on this theme, but it's actually quite directly related because, in fact, when you look at why big projects so often go wrong, and they do go wrong at an incredible rate, when you look at why they go wrong, what you find is it's usually the human factor. It's not the technology. It's not any of the other stuff. It's the people who are making decisions. They make bad decisions. The project goes wrong. And so I co-wrote that book with Ben Flivberg, who's an Oxford professor, the world's leading expert in the field of mega projects. But as I say, the book is actually about projects generally, big, ambitious projects at all scales. And we look at sort of those universal factors for all projects, and what comes up over and over and over again, it's the human factor. What matters is people.
So I want to focus on the point that you made about your focuses on how people think and make decisions. I'm a bit of a cynic. I'm of the mindset that people probably don't think as much as they used to. Right? It's much more system one reacting versus system two more purposeful type of thinking, and a lot of it's obviously because of distractions and the ease with which people can get to the right of the equal sign as opposed to the purposeful looking to the left of the equal sign. Outcome versus process that gets you to the outcome. Do you find that in your studies over time there's been less purposeful thinking across the world just because of technology? Because I think this is really critical, even in the context of what's going on with all this focus around AI.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, number one, I want to say we're almost certainly on exactly the same wavelength on this issue. But number two, you've hit upon one of my biggest concerns with modern reality. I tend not to be one of those people who thinks that, wonderful things were wonderful back in the good old days. That's fallacious reasoning. I'm a history buff. I know the history better than that. That's nonsense. But one of the indisputable facts of life is that information is moving in volumes. Things have accelerated, the volume and the pace of information. And if we go back to fundamentals, how do psychologists know about system one and system two? How do they, right? System one, for those folks who aren't familiar with it, I hope you are, but just in case, system one is intuitive, it's rapid, it's immediate. You just look at a problem and you just immediately sense the answer. System two is conscious reasoning, which takes time and effort, and hence it's slower. So how do psychologists tease out these two things? If you're in a lab and you want to get at people's system one responses, how do you do that without having them filtered through system two? Well, the answer is that they subject them to speed tests. Basically, they give you a task and they say you have to do this task, and you have to do it very, very quickly. Move on to the next question, move on to the next question, move on to the next question. Because you're simply not able to bring system two to bear and filter your response and think about it consciously. Now think about your daily work routine. Think about daily life. What's happening? We are absolutely being deluged with information, and everything is moving at incredible speed, and it's just getting faster and faster. Well, you put those two descriptions together, what do you get? You get more people making intuitive, gut-based decisions, not subjecting their thoughts to conscious analysis before they open their mouths and say, my final answer is. And the greatest demonstration, we're on the greatest demonstration of this in the world, Twitter, right? There is nothing stopping anybody from not responding to, slowing down, taking your time. You see something, you want to react to it, you have a feeling, you have an impulse. You could just wait. You could just wait. You could come back to it in 15 minutes, right? You could give it a little bit of thought. Are we going to do that? Probably not, because in the meantime, the fire hose pours out more information and that thing goes away, and then you're on to the next thing. So, what do? We get into this unbelievably bad habit of constantly just automatically jerking our knees, giving that immediate system one response to every conceivable question. I know the answer. Whatever I feel is true, and off we go. That's a disastrous way of thinking. And if you're right, and I suspect you are right. I don't know of research that confirms this, but if in fact the acceleration of technology, the acceleration of information is in fact urging us, pushing us towards more and more system one thinking, that's potentially disastrous.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because there's kind of two schools of thought on that. So obviously, the faster one responds and doesn't think, the more mistakes are made across an entire society, right? But
Yep.
the other part of this is, and I've seen some research that would prove this out, that the most effective workers and leaders are the ones that make a decision quickly. Now, that's
Yep.
not to say that they're just reacting, but there's still there's sort of a speed aspect to the reaction function of system one, but you still have to be fast for system two to be effective, and that's a hard balance, I would think, for most people to intellectualize.
Right. This is absolutely the key question. And this is where I wish, like heck, everybody would nail this down. The relationship between system one and system two. Now, there are folks who actually are, pro system one. There are folks who are pro system two. And I have to admit, I tend to be more on the latter. But we have to recognize that, in fact, the healthiest response, the best decisions come from a good relationship between the two, because they're always at work, right? You can't switch system one off and just go all system two. So they're always at work. You have to develop that healthy relationship. To develop that healthy relationship, you need to understand how they work and how they interact. So, for instance, you mentioned experienced leaders make good snap judgments, and they do. You're absolutely right. But here's the critical point. Experienced leaders, right? We know the circumstances in which system one will deliver highly accurate, highly reliable responses. We know those circumstances. There's a wonderful paper, if anybody's interested. Gary Klein, who is the great psychologist who basically is the exponent of good system one, which is to say when system one produces good positive results. And then there's Daniel Kahneman, who is, of course, the great psychologist who is the exponent of, system one makes mistakes. We got to think more system two. They came together and wrote a wonderful paper about this relationship and talked about, well, when exactly should we rely upon system one, and when should we lean more towards system two? And the answer they came up with was basically it's where you have a lot of experience in a field where you have good reason to believe that there are predictable patterns. In a situation like that, experience will develop your intuition. Intuition will give you good, reliable answers. So that's number one. Is this a situation where you're likely to have an informed, good system one decision? But then system two the second point is this. If we think about this in terms of system one and system two both have their strengths and weaknesses, well, how can we develop situations where we can maximize both? In fact, in the book, How Big Things Get Done, which is a title I will be repeating because I've got books to sell, we talk about Pete Docter, who's a three-time Oscar award-winning director at Pixar. And it's a perfect illustration of exactly how you do this. So in the Pixar process for developing a movie, you might think it's all intuition. He's just an artist and suddenly he has a vision and out comes the vision and there it is. That's not at all how they do it. They do this highly iterative process in which they take an idea, they simulate it, they test it, They go back, and they do this over and over and over and over and over again. Well, in that sort of iterative process, you are capturing the strengths of both system one and system two. So when Pete Docter, who's a very artistic person, as you can imagine, when he has an idea, hey, I think this image would work, or that character, or this line, when he has that idea, that's pure system one, right? This is a very experienced director, and he has this idea. And so he says, I think this will work. Then he puts it into the simulation. They run it through the simulation. They have audiences look at it, and people say, did it work? Did it not work? That's system two. He listens consciously to the feedback, and then he adjusts his idea in response to what he heard. That's system two. And as a result of this process, this highly iterative process, again, you're capturing the best of both system one and system two. And that's what I think every good manager should be thinking about, which is basically system one and system two aren't good and bad. It's the wrong way to think of them. They just have strengths and weaknesses, and we want to maximize the strengths and we want to minimize the weaknesses.
How does that play into big projects? Going back to how big things get done. So a lot of these spaces, when I do them, they tend to be much more focused on markets, investing. There's a pretty big thing that the Federal Reserve right now is trying to get done, which is control inflation, but it seems to be very hard because you've got now other dynamics that are causing markets to be volatile. But from the standpoint of getting things done, there's the decision to do something, and then there's the coordination. What's the bigger driver of failure? Is it the decision being wrong from the start, or is it simply a failure of execution because there's so many different players and so many different moving parts one can't fully control?
I would say that the second part of your question is very important, and I don't want to diminish it, but the first part is, in fact, the more important. One of the points that we emphasize in the book is that big projects don't go wrong so much as they start wrong. There is a failure at the beginning. There is a failure to explore the problem, to explore the situation. There is a failure to ask the right questions, and then there is a failure to do comprehensive, rigorous planning, which will result in a reliable plan. What people tend to do, and this is a very broad brush generalization, but it's true really across the board because this is how human beings roll. What people tend to do is they tend to look at a situation, they tend to quickly analyze it, quickly sum it up, right? Again, if you know your Daniel Kahneman, you know that's natural human decision making. This is WYSIATI for you folks who love the acronym. This is what you see is all there is. You quickly summarize it. You know what the situation is. You develop a solution to the situation. And the solution to the situation that comes to you first, that is most available. That solution is compelling. That solution must work. So off we go. And there are other factors at work in addition to psychology, of course. There's also politics and self-interest, because very often it's in the self-interest of folks to lowball the estimated cost, or to say that the project can be done faster than it can actually be done. And also in political terms, if you get a project going and you want to protect it from somebody pulling the plug, well, you just dig that hole really fast and spend a whole lot of money. And if you spend enough money, then it's protected, because you know nobody will be able to pull the plug and say, forget it, we're done. So those things combine with the psychology to compel people to get going way too quickly. So basically, the rhythm that we're urging people to adopt is, okay, when you have a big idea for a big project, you're all full of excitement and energy, and you really want to get going, particularly if you're working in a business environment, because business loves action and planning isn't action. You got to do, right? So you want to really get going. You want to get shovels in the ground. That's the moment at which you're in danger. You got to say to yourself, stop, hang on. No, here in this early phase, we have to slow everything down. And this is the paradoxical point. If you slow everything down at the beginning, ultimately what you'll end up with is a highly reliable plan. And then you do good planning subsequently. You will ultimately end up with a highly reliable plan. And if you have a highly reliable plan, then when you go to execute, you go to deliver on the project, it will go smoothly, and smoothly means fast. There's a saying in the military, which I love: slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Hence, the paradox is that if you just slow it down, you end up going faster. Unfortunately, the rhythm that you see time after time after time in big projects, and I'll mention the data in a second, the rhythm that you see time after time is that people start in a rush and everything's going ahead at great guns, and then problems start, and then problems collide with other problems, and then things get snafu, and it bogs down and it drags on forever. So you see fast at the start, you see slow later. We have to reverse that. Success relies upon reversing that. Go slow at the start so you can go fast later. And by the way, I was going to say the data. So Ben Flipberg, my co-author, as I mentioned, he's an Oxford professor. He's been in this field for 30 odd years. And decades ago, he sort of asked the question, well, how often do big projects actually succeed? Using the standard metrics in the field, which is, is it on budget? Is it on time? And does it deliver the benefits that it's supposed to deliver? Things like if you're building a train, it should move a certain number of passengers, or if you're creating a new product, it should produce a certain amount of profit. Does it deliver the benefits? And to his dismay, when he looked around, basically there weren't good answers to that question. And so he started developing a database. And over the course of 30 years, Bent has developed the world's largest database of giant projects. And it's all around the world. It's every country, it's every continent except Antarctica. And he finds exactly the same pattern all over the world and across a huge number of project types. I want to emphasize that too. I think it's something like 23 different project types in the database. Everything from IT to defense to buildings to whatever. And what he finds is that how many projects deliver on budget and on time? 8.5%. How many projects deliver on time, on budget, and deliver the benefits that they promise? 0.5%. Or to put that a little more brutally, 99.5% of big projects do not deliver on their three core promises. That's really bad.
And how do we define big projects? So as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, all right, if a lot of those big projects are from the public sector, then I would argue that makes a lot of sense, right? And then maybe private sector is better. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, how do you the distinction between public and private? I assume is an important thing to think through on this.
It is, and the intuitive thing is to say, well, public must be worse, private must be better. And in fact, that was sort of Bent's expectation when he started developing the data. In part because if you think about it, a lot of times the projects which the public sector undertakes are projects which the private sector would have undertaken if they had been profitable. So they give it a pass, and then the public sector says, oh, okay, we'll do it. So in other words, they're doing harder projects. And so you would expect to have the public sector getting worse results than the private sector. In fact, that's not what the data show. He finds remarkably little difference between public sector and private sector results. There are some other surprises. Every time I do an interview about this subject anywhere in the world, the person who's interviewing me will say, well, we here in whatever country I'm talking to, we're particularly bad, aren't we? Our results are really terrible. We can't build a thing. Well, that's not what the data show either. There actually aren't huge geographic differences. In fact, this is the really dismal point. We're equally bad all over the world. And that's why I say the real fundamentals here are, well, if the record is equally bad all over the world, if it's not public-private, what is it? What's the one commonality? The one commonality is humans.
And that's why experts suck, right? Because experts are humans, and I've seen some of your speeches and talks on that very point. Is it a function of this? We are just naturally are unable to think through projects taking longer or being more expensive? Is there something about the way that we're hardwired? Does that have something to do with mortality? Because we hope to get big projects done before we're old in age. What's the sort of core psychological reasoning
It's
there?
it's basically it's to go back to our original discussion with system one and system two. It's basically that we I hate to bang on this drum, but I think it's absolutely fundamental. It's Daniel Kahneman's WYSIATI, right? If you remember that amazingly ugly but wonderful acronym, what you see is all there is. It's the idea that when we encounter a set of circumstances, the idea that to say that, you know what, let's slow down, let's explore, let's learn more, let's not draw conclusions, let's wait. That is totally antithetical to human nature, right? Human nature is we open our eyes, we look at a situation, we grasp what the situation is, we grasp its meaning, and we very quickly come up with our response to the situation. We're super good at that. And for good evolutionary reasons, because of course, what I've just described is what we would have had to do over and over and over again to survive in the ancient world in which our brains evolved. So we're super good at that. And there are still today lots of circumstances in which that capacity is still valuable, and it's terrific if it leads. But a big project is by definition ambitious, complex, difficult. Those circumstances are exactly the ones in which you should not do that. The problem is that this stuff, when we talk about psychology in the abstract, it starts to sound like common sense, right? The problem is, if you say, well, hang on, when you look at a situation, maybe you don't have all the available facts. Maybe you should slow down and think a little bit more carefully. Maybe you should explore more. You should gather more data. You say that, it sounds like a motherhood statement, right? And it doesn't, well, of course I know this. Well, you may know it, but we don't do it. And that's the point. That's the fundamental mismatch. And that's why the people who actually are good decision makers tend to be psychologically sophisticated people. They're people who recognize, you know what? I'm human. And this is how humans roll. And so when I look at a situation, it will feel true to me. My conclusions will feel true. I will feel that I have all I need to know. I will feel that it's perfectly rational and reasonable for me to proceed on the basis of my conclusions at this point. But that's an illusion. And so it's a level of metacognition that is required to stop ourselves to say, no. This psychology stuff, it doesn't just trip up those other people, right? It trips up humans, and I am human, therefore it could trip up me. That's an extremely difficult step. It's an extremely demanding one. But if you look at good decision makers, and this is across the board, whether you're talking about project managers, investors, anybody, any person with a demonstrably good track record of decision making, you'll almost certainly find somebody who has a level of metacognition, right? They have a level of self-awareness where they turn their consciousness back in on itself. And until we develop that habit, and it can become habitual if you carefully develop it. It doesn't come naturally, but it can be developed and become habitual. Until you develop that habit, you're still going to get tripped up by this stuff constantly. One of my favorite illustrations of this is Daniel Kahneman himself. If you listen to Daniel Kahneman in the interviews, he's an extremely intellectually humble man. He's a brilliant man, and he's the pioneer in this field. He's the most influential living psychologist. And yet he constantly emphasizes how, he spent his entire life studying this stuff, and yet it constantly is threatening to trip him up. In fact, I've seen him in interviews in which he talks about mistakes he just made. And they're just like basic reasoning mistakes that you go, well, Daniel Kahneman, if anybody is going to be immune from this stuff, it's Daniel Kahneman. No, nobody is ever immune from this stuff. That's the essential problem. People think that somehow, and this is another problem, the success of Kahneman's book has led people to think that somehow, well, I read Daniel Kahneman's book, I'm good. I know this psychology stuff, I'm good. Well, when you think that, you're treating it like it's a vaccine. It's like, no, I've had my shots, I'm immune now. It doesn't work like that. It is a constant pressure. And if you don't recognize that at any moment, no matter how much sophistication and success you had in your thinking in the past, at any moment in the future, you may be tripped up by this very basic psychology. The moment you let go of that, you're in danger.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say you have to be psychologically sophisticated. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a small portion of the population which is, maybe fits that category. And I would think that makes group decision making suboptimal because the odds simply favor that most members in the group are probably not psychologically sophisticated. There might be a couple of people that are, but in a group decision making situation for an organization, that may not be the case. Any kind of interesting observations around decision making, big projects when it comes to a flat organization versus one where there's hierarchy, where there's more authority?
Right. That's a really interesting question. Flat organization versus hierarchy. The short answer is no. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But let me just, off the top of my head, one of the things I would point out is, to your initial point about the fact that the average group is not going to be filled with a whole bunch of psychologically sophisticated practitioners of metacognition. that's just simple math. Absolutely correct. That's where managers become so important, and that's where hiring becomes so important, right? A manager puts together a team. The team does not have to be metacognitive. It does not have to be psychologically sophisticated. It has to have the various components needed. It has to have different perspectives. It has to have diverse perspectives. But the manager or the decision maker, the person sitting at the table, that's the person who has to have the metacognitive capacity and the ability to draw out something from one person's thought and draw out something from another person's thought and to synthesize these things together into a single decision. So I would say, you don't have to have, psychological sophistication across the board, but you do have to have it in the big chair. As to hierarchy, that's a really interesting question. The Well, I think I will be speculating at this point. I've never encountered that question in this particular circumstance, so I should probably just let that go.
No, no, and I say that only because I'm kind of living that a little bit, even in my own current situation at my company, which tends to be kind of more flatter in the way it goes about, the idea that people don't really report to each other. We're all trying to collaborate. Yeah, in a world where everyone's looking at and using Zoom and all this remote work, it's a lot of collaborative type of decision making. But it seems to me that for some, especially very large projects, you need to have kind of a strong hand to direct things as opposed
Oh
to
yeah,
the potential for groupthink, right? I think is the
that's
point.
right. That's right. There's no question. On in terms of execution, if we go from, so if the initial sin is that we rush ahead, we don't really examine why we're doing the project, we don't ask that fundamental question, we don't engage in highly iterative planning which will result in a reliable plan. If that's the initial sin, well, let's say that we correct all those things and we do that and then we go and produce a good plan. Well, you still have to execute on the plan. And for that, the project manager, there has to be a project manager. And the project manager absolutely has to be strong and have a broad vision. We talk in the book about Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport. There aren't many success stories when it comes to airport projects, believe me. But one of the very few is Terminal 5 at Heathrow. And one of the many reasons for that is that the project leadership, from the very beginning, it was initially was led by the former head of Jaguar. The project leadership had a very clear vision of what the project was to be. They had a very strong plan, and they were intimately involved, strongly involved from beginning to end. And that's absolutely indispensable. If you were to ask me, one of the many reasons why California high-speed rail has turned into such a debacle is that it's never had that kind of leadership. And when you have a multi-billion-dollar project that has weak or varying or constantly changing leadership, it's not going to end well.
Let's talk about incentives here for a bit, because I think it's part of the analysis of what goes into a big project being completed and being successful is malaligned incentives,
Yes.
right? And then you can even go to the public sector on that. It's like there's always incentive to make a project last longer because you may not have, as a contractor, for example, a lot of big projects, so you want it to keep being delayed to some extent while you're still hopefully getting paid, right, on every upping of the budget. How do you think through incentives when it comes to the likelihood of a project being successful?
Well, from beginning to end, it's incredibly important, of course. But let me give you an example of how badly aligned incentives destroy projects, and then I'll give you an example of how you can align them and produce a good result. I live here in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and we have a new shiny, well, not so shiny, light rapid transit system. It's this little train and it's delightful and it cost a couple of $1 billion. And it's been a mess from the beginning to end. You just mentioned the Ottawa LRT to any resident of Ottawa and they will swear. So what went wrong there? Well, there, of course, is, as usual in any forensic dissection of project failure, there's a ton of reasons. But one of the biggest reasons was that the client, the city of Ottawa, decided from the beginning that it was going to be risk averse. And what they said was, we're going to have you, the private consortium, will have you sign a contract, you deliver it at a certain price within a certain time period, and you get paid a certain amount. And all the risk of anything going wrong is on you. And very often people think of contracting in those terms because, of course, that makes perfect sense. That gives the contractor an incentive to hurry up and get things done, and it protects you from something going wrong. And in fact, partway through the project in Ottawa, something did go terribly wrong. A huge sinkhole opened right in the middle of the city, and it cost an absolute fortune that was added on top of the bill. And because of this contract, of course, the city was protected. And so you say, well, that's fantastic. That's the contract working just the way it's supposed to work. But here's the problem with contracting that way. If a problem arises, and a problem always arises in a big project, that's the one guarantee in life. If a problem arises, then it becomes a zero-sum game. Who's responsible? Right? Because if I'm a contractor, if I can pin it on a subcontractor, then it's on them, right? And simultaneously, the subcontractor is going to try and pin it on me, and I'm going to try and pin it on the client, whatever. So every single time when you contract that way, every time a problem arises, the very first thing people do is they call their lawyers. And then they try and go, how do we pin this on the other guy? Right? That's a terrible way to run a project. You're not only are you wasting time and energy, but you're turning people against each other. You're turning organizations against each other. What you need in a situation like that is you need people to come together and creatively solve the problem. Say, how do we do this together cooperatively? And of course, that doesn't happen. And in Ottawa, it didn't happen, and the parties became incredibly antagonistic. There were lawsuits threatened, lawsuits launched. And of course, this description that I'm giving you, lots and lots of people will recognize this because this happens all the time in big projects. So remember I mentioned Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport. Well, Terminal 5 did something different. From the very beginning, the client said, I want everybody to have aligned interests. So we're going to contract in a different way. We're going to give our contractors cost plus, meaning if you do this work and you deliver on time, you get this amount. And they also had positive bonuses. So if you beat benchmarks, then you got performance and you were incentivized to go further. But there was no downside. If something went wrong, some unexpected thing went wrong, there was no downside to them. Now, that might sound crazy, right? Because that means that if something goes wrong, the cost is ultimately, the risk here is on the client. And that's true. If a sinkhole opens and that risk happens, that disaster happens, then all that cost goes on the client. And this client knew that, and they said, we're willing to do that. Why? Because when you have that contractual relationship, all the incentives are aligned. You and I and everybody else working on the project only has one interest: getting the project done successfully on time. And so what happened was, and this happened multiple times because this is a huge, huge project, of course. So multiple big problems happened. And every time a big problem happened, guess what happened? All the parties immediately sat down, they talked it out, and they creatively came up with solutions, implemented them, and moved on. And guess what? It worked. They ended up opening on time, on budget. And, who's the loser in this process? Lawyers. The only people who lost out of this were lawyers. And it's amazing to me that this contractual relationship, this positive sum contractual relationship, which encourages cooperation from beginning to end, hasn't become more common. Instead, people are constantly trying to cover themselves, constantly trying to push the risk onto the other party. And the moment you do that, you create these incentives to fight, to call the lawyer. And the moment you call the lawyer, you've lost.
Yeah, it's funny. Even if you were to apply that just to the last, several days of carnage in the financial system with some of these banks, it's like if you didn't have somebody actually acting like the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the Treasury, now likely the ECB, and do it quickly instead of just blaming each other and trying to do an investigation first, it's all over,
Yeah.
right? So you have to move pretty damn quickly when you're in these kind of situations, and that's the way you can get big projects done. And projects can be crisis management. Now, I want to pivot a little bit to the other books you've put out there, Super Forecasters, and I think it's the Science of Fear.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I named this space. It's not as scary as you think because I saw the TED Talk you did, which kind of had a similar type of title. Things aren't as bad as you think they are. Right. Um, Lay out for the audience, and this is not about the current market environment, but more of it as a general statement. How we as human beings, human in terms of our perception of the unknown, and when you have high volatility in markets, why that may not be as scary of a situation as you might think.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, that's a book length response in itself.
Very broad, yes, I know.
So let me narrow it down. Let me narrow it down. Although there are many aspects to it, let me narrow it down to this. I think this is where you want to go, and you can cut me off if you want to go take it in a different direction. But let's start with the fundamentals, the psychological basics. The psychological basics is this: we need control. When human beings have a sense that they have at least some degree of control over themselves and their environment, they are healthy. And when they have the sense that they have no control whatsoever, they deteriorate rapidly. What does it mean to have control? At a minimum, it means you have to have knowledge. You have to know what's happening and why and what's coming.
Which by the way, and I would argue it's not just control; it's the illusion.
What was this deal?
Because I would argue most people really can't control.
Right. Then that's a really incredibly important point. In fact, I should put it this way: the perception of control. That we need the perception of control. The reality is another matter, but we need to perceive that we have at least some degree of control. And in order to have the perception of control, you have to actually have some knowledge about what's happening and why and where it's going. And what that means is that uncertainty is really disturbing. We just don't like uncertainty. In fact, some of the evidence for this, people sort of get that intuitively. Okay, uncertainty, it's unsettling. You would prefer to yes or no. I want a yes or a no. I don't want uncertainty. No. It's a really deep-rooted, powerful psychological aversion. How deep-rooted is it? There are some amazing studies, but to me, the most powerful illustration of this is the fact that interrogators literally use uncertainty as a form of torture. You see this all over the world. Any place that people are abusing prisoners, they will inflict uncertainty on them. Confusion. You don't know what's happening. You don't know when it's going to happen. They do that knowing that, in fact, the uncertainty can actually be worse than physical pain. In fact, there was one incredibly weird study in the Netherlands in which they asked volunteers, I emphasize volunteers, to undergo electrical shocks. And one group was told 20, you'll get 20 strong electrical shocks. Ready? Here they come. And then the other group was told, you will get 17 mild electrical shocks interspersed with 3 strong electrical shocks. And then of course they monitor them for the physiological evidence of stress, which is, elevated heart rate, breathing rate, all the rest of it. And guess which group suffered more stress? Far more stress in the 17 mild electrical shocks interspersed randomly with 3 electrical shocks, for the simple reason they never knew what the next shock would be. Whereas if somebody tells you, you know what, the next one's going to be bad, the one after that, it's going to be bad too. At least you know. uncertainty goes down, stress goes down. So uncertainty is a very powerful aversion. Now, one of the insights that I don't think a lot of people appreciate is a lot of folks will know hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the idea that, after something has happened, you think that it was a lot more predictable than it actually was. You know, After Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, if I ask you, how likely is it, think back to then, how likely did you think it was before he was elected that he would be elected president of the United States? You will way overestimate it. You always say, oh, no, it wasn't that surprising. No, it really was that surprising. So hindsight bias is there. It's ubiquitous. Anytime we look into the past, hindsight bias is at work telling us that, that was more predictable than it seemed at the time, right? Now, hindsight bias kind of sounds like, that's kind of an interesting quirk of human nature, but it's not all that important. That's a misunderstanding. Think about somebody standing here in the present and they're looking forward into the future. Whether it's an investor looking at the market and it's going, oh God, the market's awful. Could it get worse in the future? Yes, it could. Or it could do one of 10,000 things. You have no idea. Oh God, it's so awful. Oh, the uncertainty. It's agonizing. I hate this. So what do you do in a circumstance where you need to judge? How bad is this situation? You will compare, because that again is basic human psychology. What can you compare the present and the future to? You can only compare it to one thing, the past. So you turn around and you look at the past, and what do you see? Lots less uncertainty. Thanks to hindsight bias, you see a time when there was so much less uncertainty than there is today. And then when you put yourself back in the present and think about the future, what happens? It looks even worse. It's even more terrifying because this is more uncertainty than we've ever had. This is highly unusual. This is so alarming. And as a result, this is a constant, ubiquitous source of inflammation of our fears, hindsight bias, and our aversion to uncertainty. And I think that people mistake that. They think that, as I said, they think that hindsight bias is just one of the many little biases on the long list of biases. And I think that's a plain and fundamental mistake. Human beings are constantly comparing the present and future to the past. And if we're doing that, you are necessarily engaging hindsight bias, and that necessarily makes the present and the future look worse than they are. And that happens over and over and over again. I think it's frankly a daily routine.
Well, but I agree it's a routine right now, right? Because everyone is automatically going back to the sample size of one, which is the great financial crisis of 2008.
That's right. Well, I mean, one of the craziest things, and that's a great illustration. One of the craziest, again, I'm a bit of a history nerd. One of the things that drives me absolutely up the wall is how present-centered people are when they attempt to look into the past. Meaning that events that happened recently, they loom huge in our vision. In fact, you can think of it in physical terms. Imagine that you're standing on the prairie looking backwards. That's looking across the prairie is like looking backwards into the past. Well, the thing that's right there just happened in the past. That thing is huge in your vision. The thing that's 100 yards behind that, pretty small. 200 yards beyond that, tiny. A couple miles away, invisible. Can't see it, don't care. And as a result, you have this incredibly skewed sense of the past if you don't engage in a more rigorous analysis of the past. And this is actually, you just pointed to a fantastic example of this, right? You got one prominent example and it happened recently, boom, it's right there. And so everybody's zeroing in on it. And even though they're going, well, actually, this is quite different. These are not the same circumstances. This isn't applicable at all. We're still zeroed in on it. Why? Because we have this skewed impression of the past. There was fantastic research conducted 3 times over the past 50 years in which researchers, psychologists went to Americans and they said, going backwards from the current president, name every president you can remember going backwards, as far back as you can go. And what they found, because they did this 3 times over the 40 years, is they found this, you might call it the half-life of forgetting. Basically, people know the current president, of course. They remember the one before that. That's easy. But then it starts to very rapidly drop off. And you get 4 or 5 presidents back, and most people have no idea. And the only exceptions to that incredibly smooth curve are a few very prominent presidents. Abraham Lincoln, there's a giant spike. Everyone remembers Abraham Lincoln. George Washington, giant spike, right? But basically, what happens is it's incredibly present focused. When people are asked to look into the past, they're incredibly recent past focused. And that totally distorts the reality. And that's again why, a good example is Ray Dalio. He does a ton of historical research, like deep, deep historical research. I don't think that's a coincidence. It's the people who overcome this natural, distorted perception of the past and who realize, no, I actually have to be more rigorous in my analysis, right? I have to get beyond the psychology driven perception and be more rigorous. They end up with a better analysis of the past. A better analysis of the past results in better decisions.
Maybe for the last question, and again, everybody, please make sure you follow Dan Gardner. Just given the sheer number of things you've written on and the amount of research you've done, Dan, what's been one of the more surprising things that you've come across in the various books you've written? Something that really shocked you when you actually looked at the data?
Boy, that's a tough one. For my first book in the U.S., it's called The Science of Fear. I was a journalist at that time. I was doing long form journalism. I was studying all sorts of disparate subjects: terrorism, cancer risk, chemicals, all sorts of different things. And what I was seeing over and over again when I was doing the research was there was this really constant pattern of the data and the perception didn't match. The public were worried about things that the data said that they shouldn't be worried about, and the public weren't worried about things that the data said they should be worried about. And I didn't understand that. I had no idea why, because I'd never studied psychology. And that was what started me on the psychology, onto psychology. I got in touch with Paul Slovic, who's like the pioneer in the field of risk perception research. And that was when, the penny dropped and I realized, oh, actually, there's a very good explanation for this pattern. And that's what got me started in this whole field. So I would say that I would have to point to that because that was the moment at which I realized a huge proportion of my thinking, right? If you think about any human being, this is true of literally anybody, going forward, you have to have some model of how people think and act and decide. We all have a model like that in our heads. And most of us don't think about what that model is or where it came from, and we don't inform it, but we all have a model like that. And when I encountered psychology, that's when I discovered that basically my model was completely wrong. And I hate to say it this way because it sounds flippant, but it was a come to Jesus moment because I just recognized that my thinking about human beings was just completely wrong. And so when I started seriously studying psychology, I really had to revise my thinking about everything because, if how people perceive, think, and decide is so fundamental to human society that if you change that, your understanding of how people do that, then you have to change everything. And that was exactly what happened when I studied psychology.
I think that's a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Again, everybody, please make sure you follow Dan Gardner. Check out his various books. I have another space literally in 10 minutes with a guy that some of you may be familiar with who went a little bit viral with his rant on how woke culture has gone too far, Mr. Konstantin Kisin. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your knowledge, and I'm a big fan of yours.
Thanks, Michael. It was fun.
Cheers, everybody.